My name is Fred Tisdall. I'm the coordinator of the Friends and Family program at Hope Place Centers. For almost 2 years, I've had the opportunity to work with and support families. I've been given a new understanding of the ripple effect that this disease can have on families and friends, and the opportunity to help dispel some of the myths around addiction. So welcome to the Steps to Self-Care program. Family members are often so focused on their loved one who's struggling with the addiction that they often end up neglecting themselves. So we are going to endeavor to give you some information that will help you detach and find a way through a very complicated and difficult experience to have when you have a loved one who's struggling with addiction. So here we go. A common misconception. People suffering with addiction often are seen as bad or weak. I can tell you that in my experience that anyone who has an addiction is anything but weak. To keep their addiction alive, to continue with their addiction through psych wards and through jails and hospitals, that is not a weak person. This is absolutely a disease. And I think that for many people that they struggle with the term disease. So what I like to say, if you look at the word disease, it's dis-ease, that they are not at ease with themselves. And that is true, because what's happened is that this is a disease of the brain, and the disconnect is from the brain being hijacked from the addiction, and they get lost. So we often find out that underlying parts of this illness are the actual problem. That the drinking, the using, whatever it is not so much the problem, but the solution to the problem. When addicts feel emotions like hurt and pain and grief and loss, that they're incredibly sensitive often and struggle because they have a small window of tolerance, just that they've had to create to protect themselves over the years, and it actually prevents them from feeling many feelings. So they numb out from feelings, the hard feelings, and then inadvertently they end up numbing out from all the other feelings, like hope, like peace, like happiness. Those feelings get numbed out as well. Healing old wounds requires courage, compassion, and connection. So what about this disease of addiction? Impaired control, using even when a person has no intention of using. They can stop hundreds of times, and they don't want to drink necessarily or use. But what happens is that, and we're going to talk about the neurobiology of the brain, but they create a pathway in the brain where it actually worked for them at one time, where they got some relief from their addiction. And so that created a pathway in the brain, and they have tried to recreate that over and over again, even though it stopped working for them and that it actually was doing the opposite for them, where it was causing a lot of pain and discomfort. So we also have the preoccupation. It's simple. They become preoccupied. It's the mental part of the illness where they become obsessed and they just think about getting their drug to relieve whatever uncomfortable situation that they are in. And they continue to use despite consequences. It is incredible the lengths that they will go to. Jail, hospitals, and they still continue to use. Nobody wants to live that way. This is clearly an illness. Using despite negative consequences, I think that the important part of this slide is around the denial, that they are in denial around their illness because, as I said earlier, that pathway in the brain is hijacked the brain, and it is telling them, if you use this, it will make you feel better. I was at a conference not too long ago, and one of the keynote speakers talked about alcoholics, that they actually use not to feel better, but they use not to feel bad. And I thought that was a very powerful statement. It's the truth. They just want to feel good about themselves, and they don't know how to do it. The neurobiology of the addiction, there's a pathway that we talked about briefly. When that pathway is activated, dopamine is released, and it's the reward center of the brain kicks in. There's positive reinforcement, the brain chemistry, synapses fire off, and they feel a sense of relief. I've heard people describe having their first drink and exhaling a big sigh and saying, now I feel complete. And this is what I was looking for. I never felt like I fit in or that I had value until I had my first drink. The pleasurable feelings provide positive reinforcement, so the behavior is repeated. A major feature of addiction is the loss of control, limiting intake of the addictive substance. So as time goes on, they develop a dependence. They need more and more to get to that level where they feel a sense of relief or numbness or oblivion, and they continue to use despite the consequences. Drugs of abuse are able to interfere with the normal communication process of the brain. As I said, the brain gets hijacked. So a lot of similarities between experiences in active addiction between the addict or the alcoholic and the family member. So the addict can be obsessive, and they can just be completely focused on, getting enough money to get their drug or to get the drug. And family members are often obsessing as well, and they're obsessing about the addict, their loved one. Social gatherings, occupational things fall off. They become more isolated. Families become more isolated. Manipulation, addicts will manipulate in order to use and to get their substance. Family members manipulate in order to control the use. So they feel a sense of a loss of control, and so they need to use whatever they can to try and feel like they have some kind of control, even though the reality is that they cannot control this illness. Depressed, mood, anxiety, all the same impact on family. Feelings, regret, shame, dishonesty, same with families. Minimize the severity or justify their use. Families will do that as a coping mechanism. Blame others for the use. The person with the addiction often will blame family. I am here to tell you that it is not your fault, that you did not cause this, you cannot control it, and you most certainly cannot cure it. Which brings me to the 3 C's. So you didn't cause it. Blame allows the other person with the addiction to justify his or her behavior. They need to blame you to justify their behavior. If family believe that they caused the addiction, the person with the addiction can continue to use without culpability, without having to take responsibility. It's their fault. I drink because if she only had dinner for me when I came home, if I had the right job, if I drove the right car, or if I didn't have this job, there is always some external excuse for drinking or using. So you can't control it, you can't change anyone. And it is exhausting to try and do so. The controlling behavior, anger, sadness, and fear can make life intolerable. You may have hidden your feelings, isolated yourself, and avoided contact with the addict, thinking the problem would disappear. You may have taken over the addict's unfinished business, covered up on his or her mistakes. Our greatest pain comes from trying to control instead of controlling the things we can. You can't cure it. There is no cure. Addiction, like many other chronic illnesses, is a manageable condition. That's the good news. It's best to completely abstain from alcohol and drugs. That we have figured out. The stress of trying to cope with a chemically dependent person's behaviors and actions can have numerous effects. And here are some of those effects. So, physically, headaches, upset stomach, gastrointestinal problems, mentally difficult concentrating, confusion, emotionally angry, depressed, hurt, confused, helpless, all absolutely normal responses to this illness from family. This is what family go through. Spiritually, there's a disconnect. The spiritual connection that we have with ourselves becomes disconnected. We get lost. We get sucked into the darkness. Socially isolated, distant, embarrassed. I remember a client when I was running a group, a family member who talked about their husband at 3 o'clock in the morning was falling over trash cans, making a huge racket. Lights were going on in neighbors' homes, and she, was thinking, what is going on with him? Why is he doing that? And I remember thinking, because he's under the influence of a drug. He's drugged. It's impacting his body, his brain, and he's not able to manage. That's why he's doing it, not to hurt anybody. It's just the actions of addicts and alcoholics, being addicts and alcoholics. So a typical response when a loved one is in addiction, often family members take on a codependent behavior. They get so wrapped up in the person's life that where they end and their loved one begins becomes blurry, and they are not able to distinguish themselves from their loved one's life, that they cross that line. They attempt to control the situation, they blame, there's feelings of helplessness, they threaten, they lay down the law, and with all that, the addict is likely going to continue to use. So it does bring us to codependency. What is codependency? It's a pattern or a learned behavior of self-defeating with attitudes that cause pain in one's relationship. So codependency is where, a family member, it starts to live their life through their loved one. If my son could pull himself out of this, then I can rest. Then I will feel better about my being a good parent. Codependency is when a person is dependent on something outside of himself to feel complete. Common feelings of codependency: feeling angry, you're forced to lie and cover up, phoning maybe the employer, my son is sick today, he won't be able to come in, I know it's happening a lot, I'm so sorry, but he has the flu. And so when we have an internalized sense of morality, and that really goes against our morality, that is a struggle for us to keep that going, because that's not who we are. Feeling guilty, because if you tried harder, things would be better. We know that is absolutely not accurate. It is not about trying harder or being a good mother or a good wife. This is an illness. It's set up. They're set up for the illness for a lot of reasons. So, but none of them have to do with family. We do not have to take on that responsibility. So enabling is really important to understand. Doing for someone what they can do for themselves is the definition of enabling. Examples of enabling, so paying financially, maybe buying them groceries, maybe covering the rent for them, taking away the responsibility, which their self-esteem, obviously if they're not paying their rent or able to pay groceries, then that impacts their self-esteem. They become, dependent. They lose the skills of, trying to look for a job often because it's in their nature to isolate. So now they have sometimes just given up and decided to not make any attempts to improve their lives. So they need consequences. They need to have consequences. Without consequences, they will not change. Signs of enabling, so denying there's a problem, justifying the using, acting out behaviors, avoiding problems, trying to keep the peace, taking over responsibilities. When people experience natural consequences, they're more likely to be motivated to make the steps to change. So strategies, ask yourself in the long run, is this going to help or hinder? Is this support or is this enabling? If I, cover the rent, do I contract with my son or daughter or husband or loved one who's struggling and have them sign something that they're going to pay back that money at some point in time? Listen to those who've been where you are. Al-Anon meetings. You can do virtual Al-Anon online meetings. Set healthy and clear boundaries. Someone else's denial does not have to be your reality. And definitely boundaries are important. So, 3 important actions to take with a loved one. Love them without judgment. Set healthy boundaries, as we just said. Do not accept unacceptable behavior. So I was working with a family. Their daughter relapsed. They all went into crisis. We processed around it, and the parents really understood that there was nothing they could do about it, and so instead of denying that it was ever going to happen again, they prepared themselves, and they set a boundary in terms of that they didn't get drawn into the next relapse. And the outcome of that was that their loved one who did relapse after that, it was short-lived, that they were taken out of the pattern, that they didn't, because she was in crisis didn't mean that they needed to be in crisis. And they just got out of the way. They moved into acceptance. And from that point on, and that was several months ago, I can tell you that that person did not and has not relapsed since. So often when the family changes, the addict or the alcoholic will change. So personal boundaries are limits. There are rules to set for ourselves within relationship. A person with healthy boundaries says no to others. No is a complete sentence. It's okay just to say no. It can make all the difference in the world. Boundaries emerge as we learn to value, trust, and listen to ourselves. Boundaries are about you. That when you set good boundaries, that means that you have good self-esteem. And when addicts and alcoholics are, experiencing that and seeing that it also, lets them know that you're not going to be manipulated, or that they're going to be able to take advantage of you, and they will respect that. And also, it can impact how they set their own boundaries. Find your wisdom. Wisdom is a message from your higher self. Get quiet. Go inside. Breathe. And manage your emotions. Instead of your emotions managing you. Allow yourself to practice self-care and self-respect, which is what we were talking about. Allow yourself to communicate your needs in a relationship. This is what I need. When you do this, I feel. If you use those statements, I feel angry, I feel hurt, I feel scared, and I need you to call me. I need you to let me know. I need you. And when we ask for what we need, we get our needs met, it's a clear communication, and there's no gray area, and it can go a long way to helping the addict and the alcoholic in their ability to communicate as well. Because I can tell you that they struggle with communication. Set limits in your relationships in a way that is healthy. So you do set limits. If you drink or use, this is the expectation. If you are abusive, this is what's going to happen. Express confidence in loved one's ability to start finding solutions to their problems. Setting and enforcing boundaries, not a selfish thing. Send healthy and supportive messages. Encourage yourself to explore being open to hearing thoughts, feelings, and concerns. Absolutely listen. If you can, instead of, trying to fix, often that's our common reaction. If we can kind of, in awareness, prevent ourselves from that knee-jerk reaction to try and fix the situation, and we become active listeners, many times that is all they need, is to be heard and to have a voice, and it can make all the difference in the world. So process, reframe messages, use I statements. When you come from the I, it's you can't argue with that kind of thing. This is my feeling. I feel this way. It's a statement. It's not a question. It's just you saying, I feel this when you, and I need you to, and it can be very helpful. When it's your turn to listen, really listen. So self-care, halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Physically, to eat a healthy exercise, regular exercise, checkups, lots of sleep, drink lots of water. Mentally, meditate, maybe take some time once a day, or whatever you need to really get quiet and ground yourself. Emotionally, journal, talk about your feelings. Engage in creative activities. Maybe you like to paint. Spirituality, pray, enjoy nature, go for walks. Socially, do one social event if you can, and make some kind of connection. Deep breathing can center us and calm us, and we often do a deep breathing exercise before we run groups at the men's center and at the women's center as well, and it is very helpful in regulating the central nervous system. So if you can do some deep breathing exercises, especially if you're feeling any anxiety or tension, it can really be helpful to bring you back. Relapse issues for the family. So, what does relapse mean to you? How do you take care of do I have a plan for myself if my loved one relapses? So when they are in our care, we give them lots of tools around relapse, and it just occurred to myself and Marilyn Kennedy, my co-facilitator of the family program, that family also need to have a plan for if their loved one relapses. So that may be setting the boundary that if you use or drink alcohol in our home and you become abusive, then you need to have a plan of where you're going to live, because we're not going to put up with behavior that is abusive, and that's a reasonable thing to ask. And so absolutely you want to put that down in writing. And then how do you take care of you? So I talked about that family where their daughter relapsed, and they took care of themselves. They stayed out of the way. They detached from her. They allowed her to have her process, and they went on with their lives. And it made all the difference in that situation. So it can be hugely important and certainly rewarding to have that boundary in place. It's important to accept limitations of living with someone who has an addiction, developing a healthy, balanced lifestyle. Clearly that's going to make a huge difference. Think in terms of taking care of you and not the other person. It may be helpful to have a discussion about what the family is prepared to do if relapse occurs. Our greatest pain, again, comes from trying to control the things we can't control instead of controlling the things we can. My name's Fred Tisdall. Thank you for your time, and I hope that this has been a good message